Hello, I'd like to go through the material you'll need to do this week's written assignment on four-part writing. We're looking at a page from our textbook. It's page 45, you'll see right here. And here are the voice ranges for soprano, alto, tenor, and bass, because we're going to be doing SATB writing, that is, four-part choral writing. Soprano should not go lower than middle C, should not be written higher than the G on top of the staff, and so forth. So you can refer to these in your book. Chord construction. We're going to be writing in SATB format in what's called condensed score. If you've sung in a choir, you've seen choir music where the soprano, alto, tenor, and bass each have their own staff. But for music theory purposes, we condense that kind of score down to just two staves. This is called the grand staff. Soprano and alto are on the upper staff. Tenor and bass are on the lower staff. And you can see the stem direction goes up for soprano, down for alto, and so forth. And the alto has to stay attached to the upper staff. The tenor has to stay attached to the lower staff. Even if the tenor has a high note, we don't move it up to the upper staff. And if the alto has a low note, it never comes down here. So this chord looks fine. We can tell that this is the soprano, not only because it's high, but because its stem is going up. There are rules about chord spacing. We cannot have more than an octave between the soprano and the alto. So these two notes are right at the limit. We cannot have more than an octave between the alto and the tenor. So if you think about this interval, that's an octave. These two notes are right at the limit. That's as far apart as alto and tenor can get. We don't write more than an octave between adjacent upper voices. Soprano and alto are adjacent, that is, they're next to each other. Alto and tenor are adjacent. We can go up to 2 octaves between the tenor and the bass. Here's an error in chord spacing that we want to avoid. The alto is singing a B, the tenor is singing a D above it. So these two voices have, in a sense, crossed because the alto is below the tenor is above the alto. So don't do that. Keep the voices in their vertical order with from highest to lowest S, A, T, B. Here's a notational problem. That note in the middle looks kind of like a middle C, but it also appears to be floating between the two staves. We don't know if it's attached to the upper staff or to the lower staff. Here the chord is written better. Now we can tell that really is a middle C, and the alto is singing that note. That note with its ledger line attached to the upper staff is the alto note. On the far right side of this staff is a chord with 3 notes on the upper staff and only 1 note in the lower staff. This is called keyboard format, and you'll find it in your textbook in chapter 4, but we're not using this format in the course. We're going to stick with SATB format, where we have 2 notes on the upper staff and then the tenor and bass are on the lower staff. This is made so that the right hand can easily play the 3 notes on a keyboard and the left hand play 1 note. It's a common format, it's a good format, and we'll look at music like this, but we're not going to write in this format. Let's go over here to this chord. Does this chord have good spacing? Take a look at it for a second and tell me if the spacing is all right here based on what you know. Are the voices within their ranges? The bass is right at the bottom. Tenor is fine. The voices are fine in their ranges. How about the distance between the adjacent upper voices? From alto to soprano is a 1/6, so that's fine. From tenor to alto is a 1/5, so that's fine as long as it's less than an octave. They're in good vertical order, that is, the alto and the tenor are not crossing each other. How about this big gap between the tenor and the bass? Yes, that's all right, because this space can be up to 2 octaves, and this is less than that. Terms. Open spacing. We have open spacing when there is a gap between adjacent upper voices where another chord tone could be fit in. We can see here that we're looking at a C major chord, C, G, E, and C, and there's room between this E and the C to slip in a G there. If we had a fifth voice, there's a gap there where another chord tone could go in. There's another gap here between the G and the E where a chord tone could be fit in. We could fit in a middle C here between the tenor and the alto. That's a chord tone, so there's a space for it as well. If there's even one space like that between the three upper voices, then we have an open spacing. The opposite term is closed spacing. That's when there's no space between the three upper voices. If we transfer the notation of the tenor note up to the right-hand staff, this is just scratch work to look at it. We can see that the spacing of soprano, alto, and tenor has all three notes as close together as they can possibly be. There's no gap between any of those notes where another chord tone could be fit in. So this is closed spacing. Whenever it's not closed, it has to be open. And you're asked to write chords in both of these formats on your written homework this week. The last issue of chord construction is doubling. When we're writing a triad in four voices, since the triad has three notes and we have to spread them across four voices, one note is going to have to be doubled. So in this case, there's a C, G, E, and another C. So the root of the chord is doubled. In this case, C, G, E, G. So the fifth of the chord is doubled because there are two G's. Here the third is doubled, C, E, E, G. So the E, being the third of the chord, is doubled. All of these are fine, and as the course goes on, we're going to use all of these doublings, but for this worksheet, I'm asking you to double the root in all of your chords. Let's go on to rules of motion. One of the trickiest parts of learning to write in four voices is learning to recognize all of the different possible errors of motion. Fortunately, we have a head start on this because we've just gone through a unit on two-part counterpoint, and many of these rules are the same. We're going to find that all of the possible errors are either parallel motion or a similar motion. So first, let's look at an example of parallel fifths. There is a perfect fifth from the G up to that D. The two voices move together, both of them rising by a third, and they stop on another perfect fifth between the B and the F sharp. So both of these vertical intervals are perfect fifths. The voices move in parallel motion, so this is an error. Notice down here it says check all voices. What that means is that when we're looking at four-part writing, that we have to look for errors between the soprano and the alto, the soprano and the tenor, and the soprano and the bass. We have to check all voices against every other voice. So we have to check soprano against alto, soprano against tenor, soprano against bass, alto against tenor, alto against bass, and tenor against bass. All those different combinations, because if we find parallel fifths among any of them, it's an error, and we have to fix our work. Here's a similar error, parallel octave, E going up to A. We have the upper voice doing the same thing, so we've already defined that. And this again, we have to check every combination of voices because whether it occurs between soprano and alto, or between the alto and the bass, or the tenor and soprano, parallel octaves is always an error. Okay, here is an error that we only have to look for in the outer voices. Error in outer voices only. So when we're looking for this error, similar octaves, that's what our book calls it, or direct octaves, which is another term for it, we're only checking the outer voices. This is similar motion into an octave. We can see the soprano is rising, to an E, the bass is rising to an E. They're starting on some other interval and landing on an octave. This is an error only if we find it in the outer voices. There's another condition for this. This, if we look at it carefully, we'll see we once again have similar or direct octaves because both voices are ascending and they're landing on this octave E. However, this is okay. It's okay if the soprano is moving by step, then this is not considered an error. So in this case, the stepwise motion of the soprano makes it okay to have similar or direct octaves in the outer voices. This is very much the same. The potential error is called similar fifths or direct fifths. We can see we have two voices ascending and they're landing on a perfect fifth, E up to B. This is an error in the outer voices only, and I'll tell you, just like the similar octaves, it's okay if the soprano is moving by step. We can see here it's an error because the soprano is leaping up a fourth. The last error on this sheet is something called unequal fifth. It's what you have if you have similar motion from a diminished fifth into a perfect fifth. This one can be hard to spot. You have to keep in mind where the tritone falls in the scale. Here it is, if we're in the key of C major, that has to be between 7th degree and the 4th degree. So we get a diminished fifth. They both move up by step and land on a perfect fifth. Unequal fifths are an error if the bass is involved. That is, if this is between tenor and bass, alto and bass, or soprano and bass. It's not an error if it's found among the upper three voices. Let me add that all of these errors are found in your chapter for you to read and review, except for this one. Our book does not acknowledge unequal fifths as a separate error. It's still an error because we can see that it's similar motion into a fifth. So the book is not just letting it slide, but it's not giving it a separate category. Quite a few texts do remind us that this similar motion from a diminished fifth to perfect fifth is an error whenever the bass is involved, not only in the outer voices. So that's a little bit more restrictive. However, I do ask you for this on the written homework this week. Let's go on to the homework sheet and get started with some chord spacing exercises. Construct chords with the given spacing, that is either open or closed, so we'll have to remember those definitions. Follow spacing guidelines that we talked about. Write complete chords in root position. That means the root, the third, and the fifth should all be there. And double the root. We talked about doubling. Keep voices within their ranges. So in part A, we're given a bass voice and a soprano voice, and we have to add two inner voices, an alto and a tenor. So we're going to put one voice on the upper staff below the soprano, one voice on the lower staff above the bass. So the kind of triad we're looking for in the first one is an A major triad, and we want open spacing. The root is already doubled in this chord. We have an A in the bass and an A in the soprano. So the other two tones we need are the third and the fifth. That'll be a C sharp and an E. So let's put in an alto voice and a tenor voice such that there is a gap between upper voices that creates open spacing. We can ensure that by putting the third of the chord here in the alto. See, already we've created open spacing because there's a space between soprano and alto where another chord tone theoretically could fit in. There's room for an E there. So we're going to have open spacing. Now we just have to complete the chord. Two A's and a C sharp. We need an E in the tenor. Is this good spacing? Are the upper voices within an octave of each other? Yes, that's a sixth. That's a sixth. So this one is done. Now we want a B flat minor chord with closed spacing. Closed spacing is actually the easiest one to write. We have a B flat and an F, so we'll remember that we need to double the root and have a complete chord. So B flat is there, F is there. The other tones we need are a D flat, the third of the chord, and we're going to need another B flat so that the root is doubled. To create closed spacing, just start with the soprano and count down from it, putting in the nearest chord tone in each case. So from F down to the nearest chord tone, that would be F down to a D flat. That's the third of the chord, which we need. So those two voices are close together, soprano and the alto. Now we need to write a tenor note that's as close as possible to that D flat while still being a chord tone. So it turns out that B flat is as close as can be to that D flat, staying still within the chord, and it also gives us our doubled root. So that one is done. So you can continue in that fashion here. We have to add 3 voices in the next part. So let's write a B major chord in open spacing. We have only the root in the bass here, so somewhere up above we're going to need another root. Let's just put that there in the soprano and see if we can work with that. All right, so we've doubled the root. The other tones we need are a D sharp and an F sharp, so let's put them in open spacing. We can create open spacing by putting the third of the chord here, below the soprano, so that there's a gap of a sixth where another chord tone, the F sharp, could theoretically fit in there. And we can finish this one by putting the fifth of the chord in. So now we have 2 roots, B, B, a third, the D sharp and the fifth, F sharp, and open spacing. Let's come down here. Now we're given a soprano note and we need to add 3 lower voices to create a B flat major triad, SATB, in closed position. We also know from the instructions that we need to have a complete chord in root position and double the root. So let's put the root of the chord in the bass. That's how we get root position. And I'm going to put it here in the upper part of the bass register because the 3 upper voices are going to be as close as we can possibly get them to the soprano. We have a B flat in the bass. We have the D, which is the third of the chord in the soprano. So the remaining tones we need are an F to complete the chord and then another B flat to double the root. So let's just start placing the tones as close as possible to this D. The next chord tone down would be the root, the B flat, so we'll put that in the alto. Keeping everything as close together as possible, now we need the F that would in register be right here. That's part of the B flat major triad. The F, the fifth of the chord, still needs to be put in, but we can't put it on that staff because only soprano and alto go there. We'll put that pitch on the bass staff. It's still the same pitch, but here it is notated where the tenor should be. So here's the root is in the bass. The root is doubled between the bass and the alto, and the fifth of the chord and the third of the chord are in tenor and soprano. So that one is done. I will leave this to you to do. Just make sure you get your chord in root position. That means root is in the bass, and that you get the spacing that you need, closed or open. The next exercise we're going to do is finding errors of motion. To start out with, we're going to look just at 2 voices on the same staff. Let's look for parallel fifths. Error letter A. Do you spot anything that looks like parallel fifths? How about measure 1? No, it's only similar motion there. Going from measure 1 to measure 2. I think I see something there. So here's how you would notate it if you find this error. Draw the parallel lines. from note to note, like that. This is a fifth from E to B. This is a fifth from D to A. So yeah, that is parallel fifths. And we're going to mark our error with the letter A from the key here. And you can put a little check mark by it, telling yourself that you found that one. So there's error letter A. Go on from that to look for parallel octaves between two voices. And that one is going to be pretty easy to see visually with only two voices on the staff. Direct fifths. Remember, in SATB writing, we only have to look for this error in the outer voices. Here we only have two voices, so everything is an outer voice. And so that means direct or a similar motion into a fifth. This one, similar motion into an octave. Unequal fifths, remember, means motion from a diminished fifth to perfect fifth. And there's only one spot in the scale where you're going to be able to get a diminished fifth. So that means the leading tone is going to have to be in the bass. So it's going to be somewhere where you find a C sharp in the lower voice.